The thunder of hooves echoed across the open plain as Morgan Pierce rode hard toward the horizon, his past nipping at his heels like hungry wolves. 3 years running from the ghosts of Antelope Ridge, and still they haunted him, whispering in his ear with every beat of his horse's stride, "You'll never know peace, Pierce. Not in this life." The scar across his left cheek pulled tight as he clenched his jaw, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Montana territory of 1878, shadows almost as long as the ones in his mind. Morgan spotted the lights of Redemption Creek, just as darkness swallowed the prairie. The small frontier town wasn't much, but it offered what he needed most: anonymity. As he guided his exhausted Palomino down the dusty main street, the familiar sounds of a frontier evening greeted him: piano music spilling from the saloon, the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. But peace wasn't something Morgan had felt since the war, and especially not since that blood-soaked day in '75. He tied his horse outside the Golden Rail Saloon and adjusted his gun belt out of habit. The weight of the Colt revolver on his hip was the only constant in his life these days. Morgan ran a hand through his dark, dust-covered hair and pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was busy but not crowded. Morgan kept his head down as he made his way to the bar, aware of the momentary hush that followed his entrance. Strangers weren't unusual in a town like this, but caution was a trait that kept folks alive on the frontier. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, placing a coin on the worn wooden counter. "And information, if you're selling that too." The barkeep, a burly man with an impressive mustache, slid a glass of amber liquid toward Morgan. "Depends on what kind of information you're after, stranger." Morgan took a swallow, the whiskey burning a familiar path down his throat. "Looking for work, temporary, honest if possible," the barkeep chuckled. "Honest work's always possible. Whether it pays enough is another question." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Wilcox Ranch, about 5 miles east of town, lost their foreman last month to pneumonia. Owner's been looking for experienced hands." Morgan nodded his thanks and turned to survey the room, his back to the bar. Old habits. His gaze swept across the tables of card players, the women in colorful dresses, the cowboys and townspeople seeking respite from the day's labors. And then his eyes locked with hers. She sat at a corner table, a leather-bound journal open before her, a pen in hand. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical style, though a few wayward curls framed her face. She wasn't dressed like a saloon girl, but wore a simple blue dress that spoke of practicality rather than enticement. When their eyes met, she didn't look away as most women would. Instead, she held his gaze steadily, almost curiously, before returning to her writing. "Who's the lady with the journal?" Morgan asked, his voice low. The barkeep followed his gaze. "Miss Rose Palmer, runs the town's newspaper, came out here from Boston about a year ago after her father passed, inherited the printing press and decided to stay." He wiped the counter with a rag. "Smart as a whip and twice as sharp. Folks around here have learned not to underestimate her." Morgan found himself taking another look. A woman running a newspaper in a frontier town was unusual enough to pique his interest, but he quickly tamped it down. He hadn't survived this long by forming attachments. Attachments meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death or worse. He finished his whiskey and was about to leave when the saloon doors burst open. 3 men entered, trail dust still clinging to their clothes, guns prominently displayed. The room quieted as they swaggered in, eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the woman Rose. Morgan recognized their type immediately: trouble. He'd seen too many men like them, both during the war and after. Men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar bisecting his right eyebrow, made directly for Rose's table. "Well, if it ain't the newspaper lady," he drawled, placing his palms flat on her table and leaning forward. "Heard you been writing some interesting stories about my boss's business dealings." Rose looked up, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Davidson, I merely reported the facts regarding Mr. Blackwell's acquisition of the Harper property. If there's an inaccuracy, I'd be happy to print a correction." Davidson's face hardened. Ain't about corrections, madam. It's about minding your own business. Some stories ain't meant to be told. Morgan watched the exchange, every muscle in his body tensing. He should walk away. This wasn't his fight. He'd learned the hard way that intervening in others' troubles only led to more of his own. The truth is everyone's business, Mr. Davidson, Rose replied, her voice steady despite the clear threat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an addition to prepare for tomorrow. As she began to gather her things, Davidson reached out and grabbed her wrist. I don't think you understand the situation, lady. Before he could finish his sentence, Morgan was across the room, his hand clamped firmly on Davidson's forearm. The lady asked to be excused, Morgan said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of someone who knew how to use the gun on his hip. Davidson's eyes narrowed as he sized up the interruption. His two companions stepped closer, hands hovering near their weapons. This ain't your concern, stranger, Davidson growled. It is now. Morgan's grip tightened. Let her go. The tension in the room was palpable, the piano player having ceased his melody, conversations suspended mid-word. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then Davidson released Rose's wrist with a sneer. You just made a mistake, mister. Wouldn't be my first, Morgan replied evenly. Davidson stepped back, his eyes promising retribution. This ain't over, not by a long shot. He jerked his head toward his companions, and the three men backed toward the door, unwilling to turn their backs on Morgan. As they exited, the collective breath of the saloon seemed to release. Conversations slowly resumed, the piano player tentatively striking up a new tune. Morgan turned to Rose, who was rubbing her wrist. Are you all right, Miss Palmer? She looked up at him, her green eyes assessing. I am, thanks to you, Mr. Pierce, Morgan Pierce. Well, Mr. Pierce, I appreciate the assistance, though I should warn you that you've likely made some powerful enemies. Morgan's mouth curved in a humorless smile. I'm well acquainted with enemies, Miss Palmer. Rose, please. She gestured to the chair across from her. Would you join me? I suspect you could use another drink, and I'd like to thank you properly. Every instinct told Morgan to decline, to walk away before he became further entangled in this town's affairs in her affairs. And yet, something in her straightforward gaze made him pull out the chair and sit down. Thank you, but no thanks are necessary. Men like that only understand one thing. Rose signaled to the barkeep for drinks. Force, you mean? Yes, unfortunately, that's often true out here. She studied him with interest. You're new to Redemption Creek, passing through or staying. Haven't decided yet, Morgan replied, though his original plan had been clear. One night, then move on, as always. 2 glasses of whiskey arrived at their table. Rose lifted hers in a small salute. Well, Mr. Pierce, whatever your plans, welcome to our little town. We're not usually quite so dramatic. Morgan found himself strangely drawn to her directness. Most women he'd encountered since the war either feared him or sought to save him. Rose Palmer seemed to do neither. She simply regarded him as he was a stranger with a gun who'd intervened in a tense situation. You run the newspaper? He asked, genuinely curious about how a Boston woman ended up in this remote corner of Montana. Rose nodded. The Redemption Creek Chronicle. Not exactly the New York Times, but we serve our purpose. People deserve to know what's happening in their community, especially when what's happening might affect their livelihoods or safety. Like whatever you wrote about this Blackwell character, a shadow passed over her face. Victor Blackwell. He arrived in the territory about 8 months ago and has been systematically buying or taking land from local ranchers and farmers. He claims he's bringing progress, but his methods are questionable at best, criminal at worst. Morgan had encountered men like Blackwell before. They saw the expanding frontier not as an opportunity for ordinary people to build new lives, but as a chance to amass power and wealth without the constraints of more established communities. And you've been writing about this. Rose's expression was determined. Someone has to, the sheriff is. Hesitant to challenge Blackwell's operations, many people in town either work for him now or fear opposing him. But not you. It wasn't a question. She met his gaze directly. My father taught me that the pen can be as mighty as any weapon when wielded with truth and courage. I believe that. Morgan couldn't help but respect her conviction, even as he recognized the danger it placed her in. "Words don't stop bullets, Miss Palmer." "Rose," she corrected again. "And no, they don't, but they can rally people to stand together against tyranny. I've seen it happen." Their conversation continued as the evening deepened, moving from Blackwell's operations to the town's history, to Rose's journey from Boston after her father's passing. Morgan found himself speaking more than he had in months, though carefully avoiding any mention of his own past. When the barkeep announced the last call, Morgan was surprised by how quickly the time had passed. "I should get you home," he said, suddenly aware of how the saloon had emptied around them. Rose gathered her journal and shawl. "That's very kind, Mr. Pierce, Morgan." She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Morgan, yes, I'd appreciate the escort, though it's just a short walk. The newspaper office has living quarters above it." The night air had cooled considerably as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Rose pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as they walked in companionable silence down the main street. The town was quiet now, most windows dark, though a few lamps still glowed in upper-story rooms. "There it is," Rose said, pointing to a modest building with a sign reading Redemption Creek Chronicle hanging above the door. "My humble establishment." As they approached, Morgan's senses sharpened. Something felt wrong. The door to the newspaper office stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. "Wait," he said softly, his hand moving to his gun. "Did you leave your door open?" Rose's eyes widened. "No, I always lock up." Morgan stepped in front of her. "Stay behind me." Drawing his Colt, he approached the door cautiously, pushing it open with his foot. The interior was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could see that the place had been ransacked. Type blocks from the printing press were scattered across the floor, papers strewn everywhere, furniture overturned. "Oh my God!" Rose gasped as she peered around him. Morgan quickly checked the rest of the ground floor, ensuring no one remained inside before allowing Rose to enter fully. "Davidson and his men," she said, her voice tight with anger as she surveyed the damage. "This is their message." Morgan watched as she moved through the chaos, picking up a broken picture frame, its glass shattered. Inside was a photograph of an older man with kind eyes, her father, he presumed. "I'm sorry," he offered, knowing the words were inadequate. Rose carefully removed the photograph from the broken frame, her fingers gentle on the edges. "They think this will silence me." She looked up, her expression resolute rather than defeated. "They're wrong." Morgan holstered his gun and began writing an overturned desk. "They'll be back." "Men like that always are." "I know." She set the photograph aside and joined him in attempting to restore order to the chaos. "But I won't be intimidated." As they worked together to clean up the office, Morgan found himself admiring her resilience. She moved with purpose, sorting through the scattered type blocks, gathering torn papers, all while discussing how she would address this incident in the next edition. "You'll need protection," Morgan said as they finished bringing some semblance of order to the main room. Davidson wasn't making idle threats. Rose paused, a stack of papers in her hands. "Are you offering Mr. Pierce?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't been offering, had he? His plan had been clear: one night in Redemption Creek, then move on before dawn. That's how he'd survived these past years, never staying, never connecting, never giving his ghosts a chance to catch up. And yet, the thought of riding away, leaving Rose Palmer to face Davidson and his employer alone, didn't sit right with him. "I could stay a few days," he found himself saying. "At least until you can make other arrangements." Something flickered in her eyes, relief, perhaps, though she hid it quickly. "I can pay you, not much, but no," Morgan interrupted, "no payment necessary." They finished clearing the main floor in silence, both aware that something had shifted between them, a tentative alliance formed in the aftermath of violence. As they climbed the stairs to check on her living quarters, Morgan tried to convince himself this was just another detour, a brief pause in his constant movement. He'd help her secure the building, maybe stay a day or two to ensure Davidson didn't return, and then he'd be on his way. No attachments. No complications. But as Rose pushed open the door to her apartment and gasped at the destruction that awaited them there, Morgan knew he was already more involved than he'd intended to be. And somehow, for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a mistake. The destruction upstairs was even more personal than the damage to the newspaper office. Clothes had been torn from drawers, books pulled from shelves, and furniture slashed. Rose stood in the doorway, her composure finally cracking as she took in the violation of her private space. They were thorough, Morgan observed grimly, checking the small apartment for any remaining intruders. Rose moved to her desk, which had been broken apart, its contents strewn across the floor. She knelt and began gathering scattered papers. They were looking for something? What? She hesitated, then reached into her boot and pulled out a folded document. This, most likely, it's a deed showing that Blackwell falsified documents to claim the Harper property. Mrs. Harper gave it to me yesterday after her husband was killed in what Blackwell's men claimed was a hunting accident. Morgan understood immediately. Evidence that could hang him. Exactly. Rose carefully tucked the document back into her boot. I was planning to take it to the territorial judge when he makes his circuit next week, along with my article detailing Blackwell's tactics. Morgan surveyed the ruined apartment. You can't stay here tonight. I don't have much choice. The hotel owner's brother works for Blackwell. She straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. I'll be fine, I have a shotgun. A shotgun won't stop them if they come back with more men, Morgan argued, and they will once they realize you still have that document. Rose crossed her arms. What do you suggest then? Morgan hadn't planned on suggesting anything beyond offering to stand guard, but he found himself saying, I have a room at the boarding house. You can take the bed, I'll sleep in the chair. She looked surprised, then skeptical. Mr. Pierce, while I appreciate your gallantry, I hardly know you. You know I saved your life once tonight already, he pointed out, and I'm not proposing anything improper, just a safe place to sleep until morning. Rose considered this, glancing around at her destroyed home. Finally, she nodded. All right, let me gather a few things. While she collected what she needed, Morgan secured the apartment as best he could, though the broken door would provide little real protection. They left through the back entrance, keeping to the shadows as they made their way to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, where Morgan had secured a room earlier. The elderly proprietress was already asleep, but Morgan had his key. He led Rose up the back stairs to his small room on the second floor. It's not much, he said as he unlocked the door, suddenly aware of how intimate this arrangement might appear to others. The room was indeed modest: a single bed, a washstand, a chair by the window, and a small chest of drawers. Morgan's saddlebags sat on the floor, his rifle propped in the corner. It's fine, Rose assured him, setting her small bag on the chest of drawers. Thank you for this. An awkward silence fell between them. Morgan cleared his throat. I'll just step out while you get settled. He waited in the hallway for what he deemed an appropriate amount of time before knocking softly. Rose opened the door, now wearing a simple nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair had been freed from its pins and fell in waves past her shoulders, transforming her appearance entirely. Morgan averted his eyes, suddenly uncomfortable. I'll take the chair, he said, moving toward the window. The bed is large enough that we could share it properly, Rose suggested practically. Back to back. I trust you're a gentleman, Mr. Pierce. Morgan was taken aback by her directness. I am, but then there's no issue. She settled on one side of the bed, keeping her shawl wrapped tightly around her. We both need rest, and you can hardly protect me if you're exhausted from sleeping in a chair. Her logic was sound, though Morgan suspected propriety should have taken precedence. But this was the frontier, where practicality often overruled convention, and they were both adults facing a dangerous situation. With reluctance, Morgan removed his boots and gun belt, hanging the latter on the bedpost within easy reach. He kept his clothes on as he gingerly lay down on the other side of the bed, his back to Rose, maintaining as much distance as the narrow mattress allowed. Good night, Mr. Pierce, Rose said softly. Morgan, he corrected again. Good night, Rose. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Morgan as he lay rigid on his side of the bed, acutely aware of Rose's presence. Her breathing eventually slowed and deepened, indicating she had fallen asleep. Only then did Morgan allow himself to relax slightly, though his mind remained alert to any sounds that might signal danger. In the quiet darkness, with a woman he barely knew sleeping just inches away, Morgan reflected on the strange turn his life had taken in just a few hours. He had ridden into Redemption Creek, intending to be gone by morning, another anonymous stop in his endless journey. Now he found himself entangled in a local power struggle, protecting a newspaper woman with more courage than sense, and sharing a bed with her all circumstances he would have actively avoided just yesterday. Yet beneath his unease, Morgan recognized something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Since Antelope Ridge, his only goal had been to keep moving, to outrun the memories and the guilt. But tonight, he had acted not out of self-preservation but to protect someone else. And that felt not entirely unwelcome. With these thoughts circling in his mind, Morgan eventually drifted into a light, vigilant sleep, his hand never far from his gun. Dawn came early, pink light filtering through the thin curtains. Morgan awoke instantly, his body tense until he remembered where he was and who was with him. During the night, their positions had shifted. Rose had turned toward him in her sleep, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her face peaceful in repose. For a moment, Morgan didn't move, struck by an unfamiliar feeling of what? Not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it, a momentary absence of the restlessness that had driven him for so long. Rose stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she realized their proximity, she quickly withdrew her hand. "I'm sorry," she murmured, sitting up and adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. "No harm done," Morgan replied, rising from the bed and pulling on his boots to give her some privacy. "I'll step out while you dress." In the hallway, Morgan leaned against the wall, rubbing his face. What was he doing? He should be miles away by now, putting distance between himself and this town, this woman, these complications. Instead, he found himself plotting how to keep Rose safe while she pursued her crusade against Blackwell. When Rose emerged a few minutes later, she was once again the composed newspaper editor he'd met the previous evening, her hair neatly pinned, her dress simple but proper. "I need to assess the damage to the printing press," she said without preamble. "If it's still functional, I can have today's edition out by noon." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "After what happened last night, you're still planning to publish today?" "Especially after what happened last night," Rose replied firmly. "If I don't, Blackwell wins. Besides, the people need to know what kind of man is taking over their town." Her determination was both admirable and concerning. Morgan followed her down the stairs, considering their options. "At least let me check the office first, make sure it's safe." They left the boarding house discreetly, avoiding Mrs. Hollister's curious gaze, and made their way back to the newspaper office. The morning was quiet, the town just beginning to stir as merchants opened their shops and residents started their daily routines. The office looked even worse in daylight, the extent of the damage clearer. Morgan conducted a thorough check of both floors before allowing Rose inside. To his surprise, she headed straight for the printing press, examining it with expert eyes. "The frame is intact," she announced with evident relief. "They scattered the type but didn't break the press itself. I can reset it." Morgan watched as she immediately set to work, sorting through the scattered type blocks with practiced efficiency. Her focus and determination were impressive. Most people would have been cowed by such intimidation, perhaps even left town, not Rose Palmer. "I'll need to speak with Sheriff Harris," she said as she worked. "Though I doubt he'll do much. He's either afraid of Blackwell or in his pocket." "I'll go with you," Morgan offered, helping her right a heavy cabinet. "After you've finished here," Rose paused, looking up at him. "You don't have to stay involved in this, Morgan. This isn't your fight." It was the perfect opening, the chance to agree and extricate himself, to say goodbye, wish her well, and be on his way. The words were on the tip of his tongue. Instead, he heard himself say, "I'm already involved." Something passed between them then, an unspoken understanding. Rose nodded once, then returned to her work, and Morgan found himself helping her sort type blocks, a skill he hadn't used since his days setting print for Army field dispatches during the war. By mid-morning, they had made considerable progress restoring order to the office. The printing press was functional, and Rose had begun setting type for a front-page article about the break-in and Blackwell's intimidation tactics. "We should go to the sheriff now," Morgan suggested, noting the increasing activity on the street outside. "Better to catch him early," Rose nodded, setting aside her work. "Let me get my notes and Mrs. Harper's deed." As they prepared to leave, the door to the newspaper office opened. Morgan's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he relaxed slightly when he saw it was an elderly woman rather than one of Davidson's men. "Miss Palmer," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I heard about what happened. Are you all right, child?" Rose moved forward to take the woman's hands. "I'm fine, Mrs. Harper, just some damage to the office." Mrs. Harper's eyes darted nervously to Morgan, then back to Rose. "They came to my house this morning, Blackwell's men. They said I had until sundown to sign over the deed officially or they'd burn me out." Her voice broke. "After what they did to George, I believe them." Rose's expression hardened. "We're going to the sheriff right now. Come with us. He can't ignore all of us." Morgan had his doubts about that but kept them to himself as they escorted Mrs. Harper to the sheriff's office at the end of the main street. The building was small but official-looking, with a sign identifying it as the office of Sheriff Thomas Harris. Inside, they found a thin man with a drooping mustache sitting behind a desk, cleaning a revolver. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from boredom to wariness when he saw Rose. "Miss Palmer," he said, setting the gun aside. "What brings you here today?" "Violence and intimidation in your town, Sheriff," Rose replied crisply. "My office and home were ransacked last night by Blackwell's men, and now they're threatening Mrs. Harper." Sheriff Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Palmer. Do you have any proof it was Blackwell's men?" "One of them, Davidson, threatened me directly in the Golden Rail last night," Rose said. "Mr. Pierce here witnessed it." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Morgan, assessing him with the wary look lawmen reserved for armed strangers. "And you are, Morgan Pierce, just passing through." "But I saw the confrontation and the aftermath." Harris nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Pierce, as you're just passing through, you might not understand how things work here. Making accusations against prominent citizens without solid evidence is dangerous." "I have evidence," Rose interjected, producing the deed from her pocket. "This shows that Blackwell forged documents to claim the Harper property after George Harper's accident, and Mrs. Harper here can testify that Blackwell's men have threatened her life if she doesn't surrender her land." The sheriff barely glanced at the document. "Looks like a property dispute to me, civil matter, not my jurisdiction." Morgan had encountered enough corrupt officials to recognize one when he saw him. Harris wasn't just avoiding conflict, he was actively protecting Blackwell. "A break-in and destruction of property is certainly your jurisdiction," Morgan pointed out, his voice carrying an edge. "As are threats of violence against a widow." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Like I said, Mr. Pierce, you're just passing through. I suggest you continue on your way and leave local matters to locals." Rose stepped forward, placing her hands on the sheriff's desk. "I'm printing the story in today's edition, Sheriff. The people will know what Blackwell is doing and how you've failed to protect them." For a moment, Harris's mask of indifference slipped, revealing something ugly beneath. Then he shrugged. "Print what you want, Miss Palmer. It's a free country." His eyes shifted to Mrs. Harper. "But remember, newspapers burn just as easily as farmhouses." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Morgan's hand twitched toward his gun, but Rose placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff," she said coldly, turning to leave. "We'll trouble you no further." Outside, Mrs. Harper was shaking. "What am I going to do? They'll kill me just like they killed George." Rose looked thoughtful. "Do you have somewhere you can go? Family, perhaps." "My sister in Denver," Mrs. Harper replied. "But I can't just abandon our land. George and I built that farm from nothing." "Your life is worth more than land," Morgan said quietly. "Sometimes the wisest choice is to leave, regroup, and fight another day." Rose gave him a curious look but nodded in agreement. Morgan's right. Go to your sister. Take the deed with you. When the territorial judge comes next week, I'll send him your way with my article and all the evidence we've gathered. Mrs. Harper seemed torn but eventually nodded. I'll pack a few things and take the afternoon stage, but what about you, Miss Palmer? You're in as much danger as I am. Rose's expression was resolute. I have the protection of the press and Mr. Pierce. She glanced at Morgan. For now, at least. As they walked Mrs. Harper back to her home to help her prepare for departure, Morgan contemplated his growing involvement in this conflict. He had ridden into countless towns over the years, witnessed injustice and corruption, and always ridden out again, carrying his own burdens, leaving others to theirs. What made Redemption Creek different? The answer walked beside him, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight, her determination to stand against tyranny unshaken despite the clear danger. Rose Palmer was unlike anyone Morgan had encountered in his years of wandering. She possessed a courage that didn't deny fear but transcended it, a clarity of purpose that made his own aimless existence seem hollow by comparison. And now, whether he had intended to or not, Morgan had aligned himself with her cause. The realization should have filled him with dread, with the urgent need to escape. Instead, it gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to stay, at least for a while, as they helped Mrs. Harper gather her essentials. Morgan found himself wondering if perhaps Redemption Creek had been aptly named after all. Not that he believed in redemption, not for himself, not after what happened at Antelope Ridge. But standing beside Rose, fighting for something meaningful rather than just surviving. It felt like a step toward something better than the existence he'd been enduring. By midday, Mrs. Harper was safely on the stage to Denver, the precious deed securely hidden in her corset. Rose had finished setting the type for her article, and the press was running, printing copies of the Redemption Creek Chronicle that detailed Blackwell's intimidation tactics, the break-in at the newspaper office, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding George Harper's death. Morgan stood guard while Rose worked, his eyes constantly scanning the street through the windows. He had cleaned and checked his Colt 3 times, a ritual that calmed his nerves and prepared him for what he knew was coming. Blackwell wouldn't allow such direct defiance to stand. There, Rose said finally, lifting a freshly printed newspaper. The first copy, what do you think? Morgan took the paper, scanning the boldly headlined article. Violence and intimidation, Blackwell's reign of terror. It's direct, he commented, impressed despite his concerns. You're not leaving Blackwell any room to deny his actions. That's the point of journalism, Rose replied, beginning to stack the printed copies. To speak truth plainly, especially when powerful men try to obscure it. Morgan helped her gather the newspapers. What now? Now we distribute them. Every business on Main Street, the church, the school, the stables, everywhere people gather. Her eyes shone with purpose. By sundown, everyone in Redemption Creek will know exactly what kind of man Victor Blackwell is. It was a brave plan, perhaps too brave. You know what will happen when Blackwell sees this. Rose met his gaze steadily. Yes, but I also know what will happen if no one stands against him. This town will become his personal fiefdom, and honest people like the Harpers will lose everything. She handed him a stack of newspapers. You don't have to help with this part. You've already done more than I could have expected from a stranger. Morgan should have taken the out she offered. He should have wished her well, maybe even warned her to be careful, and then ridden away from Redemption Creek and all its problems. That had been his pattern for 3 years, never staying, never committing, never risking the pain of attachment. Instead, he took the stack of newspapers. I'll take the south side of Main Street. The gratitude in Rose's smile made something shift in Morgan's chest, something that had been cold and still for a very long time. They split up to distribute the newspapers more efficiently, agreeing to meet back at the office in an hour. Morgan moved from business to business, leaving copies of the Chronicle with shopkeepers, barbers, and bartenders. The reactions varied from enthusiastic support to nervous acceptance to outright refusal. At the general store, the owner, a balding man with spectacles, read the headline and immediately shoved the newspaper back at Morgan. "I can't have this in my store," he hissed, glancing anxiously toward the door. "Blackwell's men come in here every day, they'll burn me out." "If everyone refuses to stand up to him, he wins," Morgan pointed out. The shopkeeper shook his head. "Easy for you to say. You can ride out of town whenever you please. Some of us have our life savings invested here." Morgan couldn't argue with that logic. The man was right. What stake did Morgan have in this fight? He was still contemplating this question when he pushed through the door of the blacksmith shop, his last stop before returning to Rose. The smithy was hot and dim, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil filling the air. A massive man with forearms like tree trunks looked up from his work as Morgan entered. "Help you?" the blacksmith asked, setting his hammer down. Morgan offered him a copy of the newspaper. Redemption Creek Chronicle, latest edition. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron before taking the paper. He read the headline, then looked up sharply. "Miss Palmer wrote this," Morgan nodded, expecting another refusal. Instead, the blacksmith broke into a wide grin. "About damn time somebody called out that snake Blackwell." He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "Leave me a stack. I'll make sure the boys at the lumber mill get copies." Surprised, Morgan handed over several more newspapers. "Not worried about retaliation," the blacksmith chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. "Let him try." "Name's Elijah Washington. I was swinging this hammer before Blackwell was out of short pants, and I'll be swinging it long after he's gone." His expression sobered. "Folks around here are scared, and with good reason, but fear only works when people feel alone. Miss Palmer's showing them they're not." As Morgan left the blacksmith shop, he found himself considering Elijah's words. Fear worked best against the isolated. It was why he himself had stayed alone these past years. Fewer attachments meant fewer vulnerabilities. But perhaps there was another way to view it. Standing together could create a strength that solitude never could. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the commotion ahead. A crowd had gathered outside the newspaper office, and even from a distance, Morgan could see it wasn't friendly. He quickened his pace, his hand moving to his gun. As he drew closer, he saw Rose standing on the steps of her office, facing down 5 men, Davidson among them. The crowd of townspeople formed a loose circle around the confrontation, watching with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. "Retract the article and print an apology," Davidson was saying as Morgan pushed through the crowd. "Or Mr. Blackwell will be forced to pursue legal action for slander." Rose stood her ground, chin raised. "Everything printed in the Chronicle is factual and can be proven. If Mr. Blackwell wishes to dispute any specific points, he's welcome to write a letter to the editor, which I'll happily publish." Davidson's face darkened. "You think you're clever, don't you? A woman playing at journalism in a town where you don't belong." "Freedom of the press isn't limited by gender or geography, Mr. Davidson," Rose replied coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more papers to distribute." She turned to go back inside, but Davidson grabbed her arm roughly. "We're not finished here." Morgan moved swiftly, breaking through the front of the crowd. "Take your hand off her," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. Davidson looked up, his expression shifting to a sneer when he recognized Morgan. "Well, if it ain't the newspaper lady's pet gunslinger." His grip on Rose's arm tightened. "This doesn't concern you." "I'm making it my concern," Morgan replied, his hand resting openly on his gun. "Let her go." Now, the tension in the air was palpable as the 2 men stared each other down. Davidson was flanked by 4 of Blackwell's men, all armed. Morgan stood alone, outnumbered but unflinching. After what seemed an eternity, Davidson released Rose's arm with a shove that nearly sent her stumbling down the steps. Morgan moved forward, positioning himself between her and Blackwell's men. "Mr. Blackwell wants to see you," Davidson said to Rose, ignoring Morgan now. "Both of you at his ranch tonight." "Is that an invitation or a summons?" Rose asked, rubbing her arm where Davidson had gripped it. Davidson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's call it a strongly suggested business meeting. 8 o'clock, don't be late." He tipped his hat mockingly. And bring your printing press deed. Mr. Blackwell's interested in acquiring the newspaper." With that, he turned and walked away, his men following, the crowd parting silently to let them pass. As they disappeared down the street, the tension broke. The townspeople began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. A few approached Rose with words of support or concern, but most hurried away, avoiding eye contact. "Are you all right?" Morgan asked when they were finally alone on the steps. Rose nodded, though her face was pale. "Yes, though I suspect tonight's meeting isn't one we want to attend." "No," Morgan agreed grimly. "It's a trap. Blackwell's decided you're too dangerous to be allowed to continue. Then we need to prepare." Rose's determination hadn't wavered despite the confrontation. "I still have papers to distribute, and then we need to gather evidence, all of it, in case something happens to me." Morgan felt a chill at her words. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly. "But gathering the evidence is smart. We should also consider who might stand with us against Blackwell." Rose looked surprised. "Us, you're planning to stay." Morgan hadn't consciously made that decision until the words left his mouth, but now that they had, he knew they were true. "Yes, for now at least." The smile that illuminated Rose's face made something warm unfurl in Morgan's chest. It was a dangerous feeling, one he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Attachment, connection. The very things he'd been running from, and yet, as they returned to the newspaper office to plan their next move, Morgan couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time since Antelope Ridge, he was doing something that felt right, protecting someone who deserved protection, standing against corruption rather than just surviving it. It might end badly. It probably would. But for now, Morgan Pierce had found a reason to stop running, at least for a while. And that reason was currently gathering evidence against one of the most dangerous men in the territory, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight, her courage undiminished by threats. Somehow, against all odds and his better judgment, Morgan had found something worth fighting for in Redemption Creek. And he intended to see that fight through, wherever it might lead. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a flurry of activity. Rose continued distributing her newspapers while Morgan made discreet inquiries about Blackwell's operation, speaking with those who seemed willing to talk. The blacksmith, a stable boy who had overheard Blackwell's men planning something, a saloon girl who had served drinks during Blackwell's private meetings. By sunset, they had compiled a significant body of evidence documents, witness statements, and Rose's meticulous notes, all pointing to Blackwell's systematic campaign to take control of the region through intimidation, fraud, and violence. "If we can get this to the territorial judge," Rose said as they sorted through the materials in her office, "it should be enough to bring charges against Blackwell." The key word being if, Morgan pointed out. Blackwell clearly intends to stop us before that happens. Rose sat back, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "So what do we do? If we don't show up tonight, they'll come looking for us anyway." Morgan had been considering their options, none of which were particularly promising. "We could leave town," he suggested, though he knew how Rose would respond. "And abandon everyone to Blackwell's mercy?" "No," she shook her head firmly. "Besides, running would only delay the inevitable. Men like Blackwell don't forget perceived slights." She was right, of course. Morgan knew from experience that some enemies couldn't be outrun forever. Sometimes you had to turn and face them. "Then we need allies," he said. "People willing to stand with us." Rose looked skeptical. "You saw how people reacted today. They're scared. Not everyone." "Your blacksmith friend seemed ready to fight." Elijah. Rose considered this. "Yes, he's never been afraid of Blackwell, and there are others, not many, but a few who have lost land or loved ones to Blackwell's schemes." Morgan nodded. "We need to gather them tonight. Before our meeting with Blackwell." They spent the next hour making a list of potential allies and dividing up the task of contacting them. Rose would speak with the townspeople she trusted, while Morgan would approach those who might respond better to a fellow man with a gun. "Meet back here at 7, Morgan said as they prepared to separate. "That gives us an hour before Blackwell's deadline." Rose hesitated at the door. "Be careful, Morgan. Davidson and his men will be watching for us." I've dealt with worse than Davidson, Morgan assured her, though in truth he was more concerned for her safety than his own. Don't go anywhere alone, she smiled at his concern. I won't. Elijah said he'd accompany me. With that, they parted ways, each on their respective missions. Morgan headed first to the Golden Rail Saloon, where he had spoken earlier with a young man named Thomas Riley, whose brother had been killed in a suspicious accident on Blackwell's property. The saloon was doing steady business, though not yet crowded with the evening rush. Morgan spotted Riley at a corner table, nursing a whiskey. The young man looked up warily as Morgan approached. Mr. Pierce, he acknowledged. Something I can help you with? Morgan sat across from him, keeping his voice low. I need to know if you meant what you said earlier about being willing to stand against Blackwell if others would join you. Riley's eyes darted around the room before returning to Morgan. I meant it. For Jimmy's sake, if nothing else, but who's joining? The whole town's scared stiff of Blackwell. Not everyone, Morgan replied. We're gathering tonight, 7 o'clock at the newspaper office, people who have had enough of Blackwell's tyranny. Riley looked skeptical but nodded slowly. I'll be there. Can't promise I'll be much use in a fight, though. Sometimes just standing up is enough, Morgan said, rising from the table. And bring anyone else you trust who might be willing to help. His next stop was the livery stable, where the owner, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War named Silas Tanner, had lost a prime piece of grazing land to Blackwell's manipulations. Blackwell's invited Rose Palmer to a meeting tonight, Morgan explained after finding Tanner in one of the stalls, brushing down a mare. We believe it's a trap, Tanner snorted. Course it is. Man like that doesn't invite folks to polite conversation when intimidation's failed. He eyed Morgan shrewdly. What's your stake in this anyway? You ain't from around here. It was a fair question, one Morgan had been asking himself. Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of men like Blackwell. Tanner seemed to accept this. 7 o'clock, you said? I'll be there. Might bring my shotgun along for company. By the time Morgan had spoken with his last potential ally, a rancher whose water rights Blackwell had tried to seize, the sun was setting. He made his way back to the newspaper office, constantly alert for Davidson or any of Blackwell's other men. The street was unusually quiet for the early evening hour. Too quiet, Morgan thought, his instincts warning him something was wrong. He quickened his pace, approaching the newspaper office from the side alley rather than the main street. The back door stood ajar just slightly, but enough to send a jolt of alarm through him. Morgan drew his gun, moving silently toward the entrance. From inside, he could hear voices, one of them Rose's, her tone tense but controlled. Told you to come alone, a male voice was saying as Morgan eased closer to the door. And I told Mr. Blackwell we'd meet him at 8, Rose replied evenly. Yet here you are in my office, uninvited. Morgan peered carefully through the gap in the door. Rose stood with her back to her desk, facing Davidson and another of Blackwell's men. The second man held a gun pointed casually at her. Plans change, Davidson said with a shrug. Mr. Blackwell decided he'd prefer a private conversation without your gunslinger friend complicating matters. Morgan assessed the situation quickly. Davidson was armed, but his gun was still holstered. The second man's gun was already drawn and aimed at Rose. Morgan would have to take him out first. I'm not going anywhere with you, Rose said firmly. If Mr. Blackwell wants to talk, he can come here himself. Davidson chuckled. That wasn't a request, Miss Palmer. Either you come willingly or Jenkins here helps change your mind. He nodded to the man with the gun, who took a menacing step toward Rose. Morgan made his decision. In one fluid motion, he kicked the door fully open and fired, his bullet catching Jenkins in the shoulder of his gun arm. The man cried out, his weapon clattering to the floor as he stumbled backward. Davidson whirled, reaching for his own gun, but Morgan was already on him, slamming the butt of his Colt against Davidson's temple. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Are you all right? Morgan asked Rose, quickly checking that no other threats lurked in the office. She nodded, her face pale but composed. Yes, they came in through the front just a few minutes ago. Her eyes moved to Jenkins, who was moaning on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Is he? He'll live, Morgan said grimly, kicking the man's fallen gun away. But we need to move quickly. Once these two don't return with you, Blackwell will send more men. Rose moved to her desk, gathering the evidence they'd compiled. Most of our allies should be arriving soon. What do we do with these two? Morgan was already searching Davidson for weapons, removing a knife and a derringer in addition to his revolver. Tie them up. We'll lock them in the storage room for now. Working together, they bound Davidson and Jenkins with twine from the printing supplies, gagging them with strips of cloth. Morgan dragged the men into the small storage room at the back of the office, locking the door behind them. That won't hold them forever, he warned as they returned to the main office, but it should give us some time. They had barely finished when the first of their allies arrived, Elijah Washington, the blacksmith, carrying a massive hammer that looked capable of crushing a man's skull with one blow. He was followed shortly by Silas Tanner with his promised shotgun, Thomas Riley, and a handful of others who had suffered under Blackwell's regime. By 7 o'clock, 11 people had gathered in the newspaper office, an odd assortment of townspeople united only by their determination to end Blackwell's control over Redemption Creek. "Thank you all for coming," Rose said, addressing the group once everyone had arrived. "I know the risk you're taking by being here. No greater risk than doing nothing," Elijah rumbled. "So what's the plan?" Morgan stepped forward. "Blackwell's men already tried to take Rose by force. There are 2 of them locked in the storage room." This news caused a stir among the gathered allies. "Then Blackwell knows we're organizing against him," Silas Tanner observed grimly. "He'll be preparing for trouble." Morgan nodded. "Which is why we need to act tonight before he can gather more men or send word to the county for reinforcements." "Act how?" Thomas Riley asked nervously. We're not talking about killing Blackwell, are we?" "No," Rose interjected firmly. "We're talking about justice, not vengeance. We need to secure Blackwell and hold him until the circuit judge arrives next week." Morgan laid out their plan. A small group would ride to Blackwell's ranch under the pretense of accepting his invitation. Meanwhile, the others would position themselves around the property, ready to support if necessary. "Our goal is to confront Blackwell with the evidence we've gathered and place him under citizen's arrest," Morgan explained. "If he resists." He let the implication hang in the air. "And what about Sheriff Harris?" someone asked. "He's been in Blackwell's pocket from the start." "I'll handle the sheriff," Silas Tanner volunteered. "Got a few deputies who owe me favors. They might be willing to look the other way tonight." As the group discussed specifics, Morgan pulled Rose aside. "I want you to stay here," he said quietly. "It's too dangerous for you to come to the ranch." Rose's eyes flashed. "This entire situation began because of my article. These people are risking their lives partly because I asked them to. I'm not hiding while they face danger." Morgan had expected this response but felt compelled to try anyway. Something about Rose Palmer made him want to protect her, even knowing she was perfectly capable of standing on her own. "Blackwell will be expecting you," he argued. "You'll be his primary target." "All the more reason for me to be there," Rose countered. "I'm the distraction while you and the others get into position." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch unexpectedly gentle. "I appreciate your concern, Morgan, but this is my fight too." The warmth of her hand on his arm was distracting, making it difficult to maintain his objections. Finally, Morgan nodded reluctantly. "Stay close to me, and if things go wrong, you run. No heroics." She smiled, a mix of determination and something softer in her eyes. "I'll leave the heroics to you." Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Morgan felt that dangerous warmth spreading in his chest again. He stepped back, breaking the connection before it could take root any deeper. "We should finish preparing," he said, turning back to the group. By 7:30, their plan was set. Morgan, Rose, Elijah, and Thomas would approach Blackwell's ranch directly, ostensibly for the requested meeting. The others would spread out around the property, watching for signals and ready to provide support. As they prepared to leave, Morgan checked his gun one final time, an old habit from his army days. The weight of it was familiar in his hand, a tool he had hoped never to use again after Antelope Ridge. Yet here he was, loading bullets, preparing for another conflict. Rose approached, dressed now in a practical riding skirt, her hair braided back from her face. "Ready?" she asked softly. Morgan holstered his gun. As ready as possible when riding into a trap. She studied his face for a moment. "You've done this before, not just fought, but led men into danger." It wasn't a question, but Morgan answered anyway. "Yes, during the war and after." "After?" Rose prompted gently. Morgan hesitated, then said simply, "Antelope Ridge." He could see the recognition in her eyes. Of course she would know the name. It had been in newspapers across the country 3 years ago. "You were there," she said quietly, "when the militia massacred those settlers." "I was supposed to prevent it," Morgan replied, the old guilt washing over him. "I failed." Rose's hand found his, squeezing gently. "Is that why you've been running? Why you never stay anywhere?" The insight startled him. In just 2 days, she had seen through the defenses he'd built over years. "They said I'd never know peace," Morgan admitted, the words he'd kept locked inside for so long finally finding voice. "The survivors, they cursed me as they buried their dead, said I'd carry the weight of those lives until my dying day." Understanding dawned in Rose's eyes. "And you believed them?" Morgan had no answer to that. He had believed them because they were right. He had failed in his duty, and innocent people had paid with their lives. Peace wasn't something he deserved. Rose seemed about to say more when Elijah called from the door. "It's time," the blacksmith announced. "The others are in position." Morgan nodded, grateful for the interruption. "Let's go." The ride to Blackwell's ranch was tense, the 4 of them traveling mostly in silence along the moonlit road. Blackwell's property lay 2 miles outside of town, a sprawling ranch house surrounded by barns and corrals, all of it built with profits from his dubious business dealings. As they approached, Morgan could see lights blazing from the windows and several men patrolling the grounds, more security than usual, suggesting Blackwell was indeed expecting trouble. "Stay alert," Morgan murmured to the others as they rode up to the front of the house. "And remember the signal if things go wrong." They dismounted, tying their horses to the hitching post. A guard approached, hand resting on his gun. "Miss Palmer," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. Blackwell's expecting you?" His eyes narrowed as he took in the 3 men accompanying her. "Just you, though?" "These gentlemen are with me," Rose replied smoothly. "Mr. Blackwell's invitation didn't specify I should come alone." The guard looked uncertain but eventually shrugged. "Your funeral," he muttered, leading them toward the house. The interior of Blackwell's ranch house was opulently furnished, a display of wealth meant to impress and intimidate. They were led through a grand entrance hall to a study at the back of the house, where Victor Blackwell waited. He was a large man, both tall and broad, with a carefully trimmed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as someone who had come west not to build a life, but to expand an empire. He stood as they entered, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Miss Palmer," he greeted, ignoring the men with her. "I'm pleased you accepted my invitation, though I see you've brought friends." Rose stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, yes, I thought it prudent given your men's earlier attempt to abduct me from my office." Blackwell's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. "Abduct you? There must be some misunderstanding. Davidson was merely to escort you here safely." "At gunpoint," Morgan interjected, his voice hard. Blackwell's gaze shifted to him, assessing. "And you are Morgan Pierce?" "Ah, yes." "The drifter who's appointed himself Miss Palmer's protector." Blackwell's smile turned condescending. "Well, Mr. Pierce, I assure you no harm was intended toward the lady. I merely wished to discuss business with her privately." "We can discuss it now," Rose said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "You want to buy my newspaper? I'm not selling." Blackwell chuckled, moving to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter on his desk. "Straight to the point. I admire that in a woman." He sipped his whiskey. "But I think you misunderstand the situation, Miss Palmer. My offer to purchase the Chronicle wasn't really an offer, more of a courtesy notification that I will be acquiring it one way or another." "Like you acquired the Harper property?" Morgan asked. "After arranging George Harper's accident." Blackwell's expression hardened. "Careful, Mr. Pierce. Accusations of that nature could be considered slander." "Not if they're true," Rose countered, reaching into her pocket to produce a folded paper. "We have George Harper's original deed proving your documents are forgeries, and witnesses to your men's threats against his widow." For a brief moment, Blackwell's composure slipped, a flicker of anger crossing his face before he masked it with another cold smile. "Interesting," he said, setting down his glass. "And what do you intend to do with this evidence?" "Present it to the territorial judge when he arrives next week," Rose replied, "along with testimonies from others you've wronged." Blackwell laughed, the sound entirely without humor. "My dear Miss Palmer, do you really think you'll make it to next week?" He moved toward his desk, pressing a button beneath it that rang a bell somewhere in the house. "You've made quite a nuisance of yourself, and I'm afraid my patience has reached its end." The study door opened, and 4 armed men entered, positioning themselves behind Blackwell. Morgan tensed, his hand moving subtly toward his gun. "Now," Blackwell continued, his pretense of civility evaporating, "here's what's going to happen. Miss Palmer will sign over the deed to her newspaper. Mr. Pierce and his friends will be escorted from my property if they're cooperative. If not—" He shrugged eloquently. Morgan exchanged a quick glance with Elijah and Thomas. They were outnumbered, but their other allies should be in position by now. "And if I refuse?" Rose asked, her chin raised defiantly. Blackwell's smile was predatory. "Then I'm afraid there will be another tragic accident in Redemption Creek. Perhaps a fire at the newspaper office with the owner sadly trapped inside." The threat hung in the air, explicit and chilling. Morgan had heard enough. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to Elijah, who reached slowly into his pocket. "I think we've heard all we need to," Morgan said, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Victor Blackwell, we're placing you under citizen's arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." For a moment, Blackwell looked genuinely shocked. Then he began to laugh. "Arrest me, in my own home, with my men surrounding us." He shook his head. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Pierce." "Not just us," Morgan replied calmly. "Your house is surrounded by townspeople who have had enough of your tyranny." As if on cue, Elijah withdrew his hand from his pocket and struck a match, holding it to the window as a signal to those waiting outside. Blackwell's amusement vanished. "Kill them," he ordered his men. "All of them." What happened next was chaos. Morgan drew his gun as Blackwell's men reached for theirs, but the first shot came from an unexpected source, Rose Palmer, who pulled a small derringer from her skirt pocket and fired at one of Blackwell's men, striking him in the leg. Morgan took advantage of the momentary distraction to shoot another of Blackwell's guards in the arm, while Elijah charged a third man like a bull, his massive form colliding with the guard and sending them both crashing into a bookcase. Thomas, less experienced in combat, ducked behind a leather armchair as the remaining guard fired wildly in his direction. Outside, gunshots and shouts indicated their allies had engaged with Blackwell's men patrolling the grounds. Amid the confusion, Blackwell himself lunged for a rifle mounted on the wall behind his desk. Morgan saw the movement and fired, his bullet splintering the wooden stock just as Blackwell's fingers closed around it. "It's over, Blackwell," Morgan called above the din. "Surrender now before more blood is shed." Instead of replying, Blackwell grabbed a small pistol from his desk drawer and aimed directly at Rose, who was crouched behind an overturned side table. Morgan reacted instinctively, throwing himself toward her as Blackwell fired. He felt a searing pain across his upper arm as the bullet grazed him, but he managed to tackle Rose to the floor, shielding her with his body as more shots rang out. When he looked up, Elijah had disarmed the guard he'd been wrestling and now stood over Blackwell, his massive hammer raised threateningly. "Drop the gun," the blacksmith growled, "or I'll show you what this does to a man's skull." Blackwell hesitated, wild-eyed, but with his men disabled and more townspeople now pouring into the house, he finally lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he snarled as Morgan pulled him to his feet and secured his hands behind his back with a length of rope Elijah provided. "I have friends in the territorial government. You'll all hang for this." "I doubt that," Rose said, rising from the floor with Morgan's help. Not once the judge sees our evidence and hears testimony from half the town. The sounds of fighting outside had diminished, replaced by the voices of their allies securing the remaining guards. Thomas Riley, who had emerged shakily from behind the armchair, went to the window and signaled the all clear. "Are you hurt?" Morgan asked Rose, suddenly aware of the closeness between them, his hands still on her shoulders from helping her up. "No," she replied, her eyes widening as she noticed the blood seeping through his sleeve. "But you are." Morgan glanced at his arm dismissively. "Just a graze, I've had worse." Rose frowned, clearly not accepting his downplaying of the injury. "It needs tending. Once we've secured Blackwell and his men." The next hour was spent rounding up all of Blackwell's guards and securing them in one of his own barns under the watch of several armed townspeople. Blackwell himself was kept separate, tied to a chair in his study, while Rose documented everything they'd found in his desk, including records of bribes paid to Sheriff Harris and threatening letters to various property owners. By the time they were ready to return to town, with Blackwell and his men loaded into wagons for transport to the jail, Morgan's arm was throbbing painfully, though he did his best to hide his discomfort. Rose, however, wasn't fooled. As the procession prepared to depart, she appeared at his side with clean cloths and a bottle of whiskey. "Let me see your arm before we go," she insisted. "It can wait until we reach town," Morgan protested, but Rose was already rolling up his torn sleeve. "Don't be stubborn," she chided, examining the wound. "The bullet didn't lodge, but it's deep enough to need cleaning." Morgan submitted to her ministrations, wincing as she poured whiskey over the gash. Her touch was gentle but efficient as she bound the wound with strips of clean cloth. "There," she said when she'd finished. "That should hold until Dr. Mitchell can look at it properly." Morgan found himself strangely moved by her care. It had been a long time since anyone had tended to his wounds, since anyone had cared enough to insist. "Thank you," he said simply. Rose looked up at him, her hands still resting lightly on his arm. In the lantern light, her eyes reflected a mix of emotions: relief, determination, and something deeper that made Morgan's breath catch. "Thank you," she replied softly, "for staying, for helping, when you could have ridden away." Morgan had no answer that wouldn't reveal too much of his own confused feelings. Instead, he simply nodded, stepping back slightly to break the spell between them. The moment passed as Elijah approached to inform them the wagons were ready. Together, they joined the procession back to Redemption Creek, where an extraordinary scene awaited them. Word had spread through town about the confrontation at Blackwell's ranch, and despite the late hour, people lined the streets to watch as Blackwell and his men were paraded to the jail. Some cheered, others simply stared in disbelief at the sight of the powerful man now bound and defeated. Sheriff Harris was conspicuously absent, having apparently fled town when he heard of Blackwell's capture. One of his deputies, a young man who had never been comfortable with Harris's corruption, met them at the jailhouse and officially took the prisoners into custody. "I've sent telegrams to the territorial capital," the deputy informed them. "The judge is actually in Thompson's Fork, just 2 days' ride from here. He's agreed to come immediately given the circumstances." This was better than they had hoped. With the judge arriving soon and Blackwell and his men securely locked away, the immediate danger had passed. As the townspeople who had participated in the raid gradually dispersed to their homes, exhausted but triumphant, Morgan found himself at a crossroads. His original plan to leave Redemption Creek at first light no longer seemed urgent. The threat that had drawn him into this conflict was contained, but something else now held him here, something he wasn't ready to name, but couldn't deny. "You should see the doctor about that arm," Rose said, appearing beside him as he stood outside the jailhouse, watching the last of their allies heading home. Morgan nodded. "Probably, though it's late to be disturbing Dr. Mitchell. He won't mind, not tonight." She hesitated, then added, "Or you could come back to my place. I have supplies for cleaning and bandaging it properly." The invitation hung in the air between them, carrying potential meanings beyond the practical offer of medical care. "Your office is still a mess from the break-in," Morgan reminded her. Rose smiled tiredly. True, but the living quarters are somewhat salvageable, at least enough to tend a wound and perhaps offer a cup of coffee to a hero. I'm no hero, Morgan objected automatically. The town would disagree, Rose countered. As would I. Morgan wanted to argue further but found he lacked the energy. The night's events, coming after days of tension and little sleep, had drained him completely. And beneath his exhaustion lurked the knowledge that soon he would need to decide. Stay in Redemption Creek or move on, as he always had before. Coffee sounds good, he conceded, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the newspaper office. The building was indeed still in disarray, though someone, likely Rose before they had departed for Blackwell's ranch, had made an effort to straighten the worst of the mess in the living quarters upstairs. Rose lit a lamp and gestured for Morgan to sit at a small table while she put water on to boil for coffee and gathered medical supplies. Morgan removed his coat and rolled up his sleeve, revealing the blood-soaked bandage she had applied earlier. It's bleeding more than it should be, Rose observed with concern as she returned to the table. Let me see. She unwrapped the makeshift bandage carefully, her forehead creasing in concentration. The wound looked worse in the lamplight, a deep furrow across his upper arm that had indeed continued to bleed steadily. This needs stitching, Rose decided, meeting his gaze. I can do it, but it will hurt, Morgan nodded. Go ahead. She sterilized a needle in the flame of the lamp, then threaded it with catgut from her medical supplies. Morgan braced himself as she began to sew the edges of the wound together, her hands remarkably steady despite the late hour and the stresses of the day. You've done this before, he observed, focusing on her face rather than the pain. Rose nodded, not looking up from her work. My father insisted I learn basic medical skills before we came west. He said a newspaper woman needed to be self-sufficient. A small smile touched her lips. Though I doubt this is quite what he had in mind. Morgan watched her as she worked, struck by the contradictions she embodied. Gentle yet fierce, refined yet practical, vulnerable yet indomitably strong. In just 2 days, Rose Palmer had appended his carefully constructed solitude, forcing him to care about something beyond his own survival for the first time in years. There, she said finally, cutting the thread and applying a clean bandage. Not my neatest work, but it should hold. Thank you, Morgan said, genuinely grateful, for this and everything else. Rose looked up at him curiously. Everything else, Morgan struggled to articulate what he meant. For making me remember there are things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. He paused, then added quietly, I'd forgotten that. Understanding softened her features. Because of what happened at Antelope Ridge, Morgan tensed at the mention of the name but found he didn't want to retreat behind his usual walls. Not with her. Yes, after that. I couldn't see the point anymore in trying to help, in caring. It seemed safer to just keep moving, never get involved. And now, Rose asked softly, her eyes holding his. Now I'm not sure, he admitted. Being here, helping you and the town stand up to Blackwell, it felt right. But I don't know if I can. He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Rose didn't press him. Instead, she rose to check on the boiling water, preparing 2 cups of coffee, which she brought back to the table. You don't have to decide anything tonight, she said, passing him a steaming cup. Or tomorrow. Redemption Creek isn't going anywhere. The simple acceptance in her words eased something in Morgan's chest. No demands, no expectations, just an open door should he choose to walk through it. They sat in companionable silence, sipping their coffee as the adrenaline of the night's events gradually faded, leaving bone-deep weariness in its wake. Morgan found his eyes growing heavy, the combination of exhaustion, pain, and the warm drink making it difficult to stay alert. Rose must have noticed because she stood and said, You should rest. The spare bedroom is a mess from the break-in, but my bed is intact. You can sleep there. Morgan shook his head. I can't take your bed. I'll be fine in a chair. Don't be ridiculous, Rose argued. You're injured and exhausted. The bed is large enough for both of us, just as it was last night, unless... She hesitated. Unless you'd prefer to go back to the boarding house. The thought of walking all the way back to Mrs. Hollister's was thoroughly unappealing in his current state. And the memory of last night of Rose sleeping peacefully beside him was not an unpleasant one. "If you're sure you don't mind," Morgan conceded. Rose's smile was soft with fatigue. "I don't mind." They prepared for sleep with the practical efficiency of two people too tired for awkwardness. Morgan removed his boots and gun belt but kept his clothes on, while Rose disappeared briefly to change into a nightgown, returning with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders as she had the previous night. The bed was indeed still made, having escaped the worst of the vandalism. They settled on opposite sides, both careful to maintain space between them. "Good night, Morgan," Rose murmured, her voice already thick with approaching sleep. "Good night, Rose." Despite his exhaustion, Morgan found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to quiet. The events of the past 2 days played through his thoughts, riding into Redemption Creek, a solitary drifter, meeting Rose, confronting Blackwell, and now lying here beside her, having somehow found himself part of something meaningful again. It terrified him, this potential for attachment. For new pain when inevitably something went wrong. The ghosts of Antelope Ridge whispered at the edges of his consciousness, reminding him of the cost of failure. Yet beneath those fears stirred something else, a fragile hope that perhaps the curse laid upon him was not immutable. That perhaps peace might still be possible, not through endless running, but through standing still. Through connection. Beside him, Rose's breathing had deepened into the rhythmic pattern of sleep. Morgan glanced over, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the way the moonlight from the window cast silver highlights in her auburn hair. As if sensing his gaze, Rose shifted in her sleep, turning toward him. Morgan froze as she unconsciously moved closer, her head coming to rest against his shoulder, one hand settling lightly on his chest. He should wake her, or at least carefully move away. But something stopped him, the peaceful expression on her face, the trust implicit in her unconscious gesture. Instead, he remained still, scarcely breathing, as Rose settled against him with a small sigh of contentment. And then, like a revelation, it struck him. For the first time in 3 years, the restless urge to keep moving, to stay ahead of his ghosts, had quieted. In its place was a profound stillness, a moment of perfect peace as this brave, remarkable woman slept against his chest. They said he'd never know peace, but perhaps they had been wrong. Morning came with golden light filtering through the curtains and the distant sounds of a town coming to life. Morgan awoke slowly, awareness returning in gradual waves, the soft weight against his side, the scent of lavender, the steady rhythm of breathing not his own. Rose was still asleep, her head pillowed on his chest, one arm draped across him. During the night, Morgan's own arm had come around her, holding her close. They fit together as though designed for this very proximity, her curves nestled perfectly against his angles. For a long moment, Morgan simply lay there, savoring a feeling he had thought lost to him forever, contentment. Not the absence of pain or fear, but something richer, a positive presence, a rightness he couldn't articulate but felt in his bones. Eventually, Rose stirred, her eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks before she opened her eyes. There was a moment of confusion as she registered their position, then a soft blush spread across her cheeks. "Oh," she said, moving to pull away. "I'm sorry." Morgan surprised himself by tightening his arm slightly, preventing her retreat. "Don't be." Their eyes met, a world of unspoken questions and possibilities passing between them. Rose settled back against him, her blush deepening but a small smile playing at her lips. "I didn't mean to use you as a pillow," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. "I didn't mind," Morgan replied honestly. They remained that way for several minutes, neither willing to break the spell by moving or speaking further. The sounds of the town grew louder, wagon wheels on the street below, voices calling greetings, the distant hammer of the blacksmith already at work. Finally, Rose sighed and sat up, running a hand through her tousled hair. "I should get dressed. There's so much to do today, the newspaper to repair, statements to gather for the judge, checking on our prisoners." Morgan nodded, already missing her warmth as he too sat up, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. "How's the arm?" Rose asked, noticing his grimace. "Better," he assured her, and it was true. The throbbing had subsided to a dull ache and the bandage showed no fresh blood. Rose studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "And how are you about everything else?" Morgan knew what she was really asking, about staying. About whatever was growing between them, about the decision he hadn't yet made. He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm still here." It wasn't a commitment, not really, but it was more than he had offered anyone in years. And from the way Rose's eyes softened, she understood both what he was saying and what he wasn't yet ready to say. "Yes, you are," she agreed simply, "and I'm glad of it." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The judge arrived from Thompson's Fork and set up court in the town hall. Testimonies were given, evidence presented, and Victor Blackwell and his men were formally charged with multiple crimes, from fraud and extortion to conspiracy to commit murder. Rose covered the proceedings in daily special editions of the Chronicle, which Morgan helped her print after they had repaired the damaged press. The people of Redemption Creek, emboldened by Blackwell's fall, came forward with additional stories of his corruption, strengthening the case against him. Sheriff Harris was found 2 towns over, attempting to flee the territory. He was brought back to face charges of his own for his complicity in Blackwell's schemes. Throughout it all, Morgan remained by Rose's side, helping rebuild her vandalized office, standing guard during the court proceedings, and continuing to share her bed each night, though always with propriety, despite the growing tension between them. He told himself he was staying only until Blackwell's sentencing, only until he knew Rose was truly safe. But as the days passed, that justification rang increasingly hollow. The truth was simpler and more frightening. He didn't want to leave, not Redemption Creek and especially not Rose. A week after Blackwell's capture, the judge handed down his verdict, guilty on all counts. Blackwell would be transported to the territorial prison to serve a 20-year sentence. His men received lesser but still substantial sentences for their roles in his criminal enterprise. That evening, the town held an impromptu celebration at the Golden Rail Saloon. The piano player pounded out lively tunes, drinks flowed freely, and the atmosphere was one of relief and triumph. Rose was the guest of honor, receiving thanks and congratulations from townspeople who had previously been too frightened to even speak to her. Morgan watched from a corner table, nursing a whiskey. He was happy for Rose, she deserved the recognition, but he found himself uncomfortable with the attention that occasionally spilled his way. He wasn't used to being thanked, to being regarded as something of a hero. It didn't align with how he saw himself, not one for celebrations. Elijah Washington asked, dropping his massive frame into the chair opposite Morgan. Morgan shrugged. "Just taking a moment to breathe." The blacksmith nodded, his perceptive eyes studying Morgan over his beer. "Been thinking about moving on, haven't you?" The direct question caught Morgan off guard. "What makes you say that? Got that look about you, like a horse that's not sure whether to bolt or settle." Elijah took a long drink. "Seen it before in men who've carried something heavy for too long, hard for them to believe they might set it down." Morgan was silent, unsure how to respond to such insight from a man he barely knew. Elijah didn't seem to expect a reply. He simply continued, "Town's changing. Blackwell's properties will be auctioned, his land returned to those he stole it from. We'll need good men to help rebuild. Men who know right from wrong and aren't afraid to stand for it." He glanced meaningfully toward Rose, who was laughing at something Thomas Riley had said. "And some folks might have particular reason to hope you stay." With that, the blacksmith rose, clapped Morgan on the shoulder and returned to the bar, leaving Morgan to his thoughts. Across the room, Rose caught his eye and smiled, excusing herself from her conversation to make her way over to his table. "Hiding?" she asked teasingly as she sat beside him. "Observing," Morgan corrected, finding himself smiling back. It was becoming easier smiling around her. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Rose gestured to the celebrating townspeople. "A week ago, these same people were too afraid to speak against Blackwell. Now look at them." "That's your doing," Morgan said. "Your courage inspired theirs." Rose shook her head. "Not just mine, yours too, and Elijah's and everyone else who stood with us that night." She placed her hand over his on the table. People just need to know they're not alone in wanting something better. The simple truth of her words resonated with something deep inside Morgan. Isn't that what he had been alone for too long, carrying his burdens in solitude because he believed that's what he deserved? Rose, he began, not sure what he wanted to say but feeling the need to say something. She squeezed his hand. I know that look, Morgan Pierce. You're thinking of leaving, aren't you? There was no accusation in her tone, just a quiet sadness that twisted something in his chest. I don't know, he admitted. It's what I do, what I've done since, for a long time. Rose nodded, her eyes understanding but also challenging. Running doesn't heal wounds, Morgan, it just keeps them from closing. And staying, he asked softly. What does that do? Her gaze held his, steady and sure. It gives them a chance to scar over. To become part of you without defining you. Morgan looked down at their joined hands, her smaller one covering his larger, rougher one. Such a simple gesture of connection, yet it represented everything he had denied himself these past years. I'm not sure I know how to stay anymore, he confessed. Perhaps it's time to learn, Rose suggested gently. And Redemption Creek seems as good a place as any to try. Before Morgan could respond, a shout from the doorway drew everyone's attention. The young deputy who had been guarding the jail burst into the saloon, his face flushed with exertion. Fire, he called. At the Chronicle office, it's ablaze. Rose was on her feet instantly, Morgan right beside her as they pushed through the suddenly chaotic crowd toward the door. Outside, the night sky was illuminated by an orange glow coming from the direction of the newspaper office. They ran down the street, joining the growing crowd of townspeople who were already forming a bucket line from the town pump to the burning building. Flames licked up the sides of the structure, smoke billowing from the broken windows. How did it start? Morgan demanded of no one in particular, his heart pounding with a terrible suspicion. Deliberate, Elijah confirmed grimly, appearing beside them with an empty bucket in his massive hands. Found a broken lamp and the smell of coal oil around the back. Rose's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on her burning office, her business, her home, her father's legacy. Blackwell's men, she whispered. Some must have escaped the roundup. Morgan's mind raced. Blackwell was locked up, but they had only captured the men present at his ranch that night. There could be others, men hired from outside the territory, perhaps, or local sympathizers who had stayed hidden during the confrontation. The bucket line was working furiously, but the fire had already taken hold of the building's dry wooden structure. It was clear the Chronicle office would be a total loss. Your papers, Morgan said suddenly, turning to Rose. The evidence against Blackwell, your father's documents, are they inside? Rose shook her head. Most are at the courthouse with the judge, but my father's journals, his personal papers. Her voice broke. Without another word, Morgan strode toward the burning building, ignoring the shouts of warning from those fighting the fire. Morgan, no, Rose called after him, but he was already at the door, bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth against the smoke. The ground floor was an inferno, the printing press engulfed in flames, paper and furniture feeding the blaze. Morgan skirted the worst of it, making for the stairs to the living quarters. The heat was intense, sweat immediately soaking his shirt as he climbed the partially burning staircase, testing each step before committing his weight. Upstairs, the smoke was thicker, but the flames hadn't yet consumed everything. Morgan moved quickly to Rose's desk, where he knew she kept her father's journals. The small chest containing them was there, untouched by fire though hot to the touch. He grabbed it, then looked around for anything else of personal value he could salvage. His eyes fell on the repaired picture frame containing the photograph of Rose's father. He snatched it up, tucking it inside his shirt before turning back toward the stairs. The way down was more treacherous now, parts of the staircase beginning to crumble under the fire's assault. Morgan descended carefully, the chest clutched tightly under one arm. He was halfway down when a burning beam crashed in front of him, blocking the path. Smoke filled his lungs as he sought another way out. The window, it was his only chance. Morgan backtracked up the stairs and moved to the window overlooking the alley behind the building. Below, he could see people gathered, pointing up at him. With no time to hesitate, Morgan used the chest to break the glass, then dropped it down to waiting hands below. He climbed onto the window ledge just as the floor behind him began to give way, the fire eating through the wooden boards. The drop was about 15 feet survivable but not pleasant. Morgan jumped, trying to roll as he hit the ground to absorb the impact. Pain shot through his ankle and previously injured arm as he landed awkwardly, but he was out of the burning building. Hands helped him to his feet and away from the heat of the fire. Through smoke-stung eyes, Morgan saw Rose pushing through the crowd toward him, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "You idiot," she cried, throwing her arms around him despite his smoke-blackened appearance. "You could have been killed." Morgan held her awkwardly with his good arm, suddenly aware of how much he was leaning on her for support, his injured ankle protesting his weight. "Your father's journals," he explained, gesturing to where someone had set the chest safely away from the fire. "And this." He reached inside his shirt to produce the slightly singed photograph. Rose took the picture frame, staring at it and then up at Morgan with an expression that made his heart stutter in his chest. Before he could react, she stretched up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a brief but fervent kiss that silenced the crowd around them. "Thank you," she whispered as she pulled away, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But don't you ever do something so foolish again." Morgan was saved from having to respond by the timely arrival of Dr. Mitchell, who insisted on examining his injuries immediately. His ankle wasn't broken, just badly sprained, and the stitches in his arm had held despite the exertion. The doctor bound his ankle tightly and recommended minimal weight bearing for at least a week, advice Morgan knew would be difficult to follow given the circumstances. By dawn, the fire had been contained. Though the newspaper office was a total loss, the structure reduced to smoldering ruins. Rose stood before it as the sun rose, her face etched with exhaustion and sorrow but also determination. "They thought this would silence me," she said as Morgan stood beside her, leaning on a cane the doctor had provided. "Just like they thought ransacking the office would. What will you do?" Morgan asked, though he already knew the answer. Rose turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunrise. "Rebuild, start again. The Chronicle is more than a building or a printing press. It's a voice for truth in this community, and that voice won't be silenced by fire." Her resilience amazed him. Where others might see defeat, Rose Palmer saw only a temporary setback, another challenge to overcome. "Where will you live in the meantime?" Morgan asked practically. "And work. Mrs. Hollister has offered me a room at the boarding house," Rose replied. "And Sila's tanner has an old shed behind the livery that he says I can use temporarily once we clean it out. There's even a small press in Thompson's Fork that's for sale. Thomas Riley is riding over today to inquire about it." Of course, she had already made arrangements. Morgan shouldn't have been surprised, yet he found himself curiously disappointed that she hadn't turned to him first for help. As if reading his thoughts, Rose added softly, "I hoped you might help me set up the new office, if you're planning to stay that long." The question hung between them, more significant now after everything they had experienced together. Morgan looked from the smoldering ruins of Rose's old life to her face, tired, soot-streaked, but still beautiful in its strength and hope. In that moment, the last of his resistance crumbled. The urge to run, to protect himself from further pain by avoiding attachment, it was still there, but vastly diminished, overwhelmed by something stronger. The desire to stay, to build something meaningful, to see what might grow between himself and this remarkable woman. "I'll stay," Morgan said simply, "for as long as you want me to." The smile that bloomed on Rose's face was like the sunrise itself, warm, radiant, full of promise for the day ahead. She took his hand, twining her fingers with his. "Then we'd better get started," she said. "We have a newspaper to rebuild." Over the next few weeks, Redemption Creek witnessed a remarkable transformation. The town, freed from Blackwell's oppressive influence, seemed to take a collective deep breath and begin to flourish. The auction of Blackwell's properties restored land to its rightful owners. The Harper farm was held in trust for Mrs. Harper's return from Denver. A new sheriff was elected, the young deputy who had assisted in Blackwell's capture, and he set about establishing a more just and transparent law enforcement system. And in the midst of it all, the Redemption Creek Chronicle rose from the ashes. The shed behind Silas Tanner's livery was cleaned out, repaired, and converted into a functional, if modest, newspaper office. The press from Thompson's Fork was installed, and just 2 weeks after the fire, the Chronicle published its first new edition. Morgan found himself deeply involved in all aspects of the rebuilding. His carpentry skills, honed during his Army years, proved valuable in renovating the temporary office. He learned the basics of operating the printing press, often working late into the night alongside Rose to ensure the paper came out on time. More surprisingly, he discovered he had a talent for reporting. His direct, observant style complemented Rose's more eloquent prose, and soon he was contributing regular articles on everything from town council meetings to profiles of local businesses. His presence in Rose's life had evolved from protector to partner, both professionally and, increasingly, personally. Though propriety dictated they maintain separate residences, Morgan in a room at the boarding house, Rose and another few in town were fooled about the depth of their relationship. They still hadn't spoken directly of feelings or future plans, but the trajectory seemed clear to everyone who saw them together, everyone except perhaps Morgan himself, who still battled occasional doubts about his worthiness for happiness after Antelope Ridge. 6 weeks after the fire, on a crisp autumn evening, Morgan sat at his desk in the Chronicle office, finishing an article about plans for the town's first harvest festival. Rose was across from him, editing copy for the next day's edition. The lamplight cast a warm glow over the small space, making it feel intimate and homey despite its utilitarian purpose. "Listen to this," Rose said, looking up from a letter she was reading. "Dear editor, I wish to express my profound gratitude to the citizens of Redemption Creek for their courage in standing against tyranny. It's from Mrs. Harper. She's coming back next week to reclaim her farm." Morgan smiled. "That's good news. Will you print the letter?" "Of course." "Along with my editorial about the 1-month anniversary of Blackwell's conviction." She set the letter aside, stretching her arms above her head to relieve the stiffness from hours of writing. "What time is it?" Morgan checked his pocket watch. "Nearly 10. We should finish up." They had fallen into this routine, working late, walking back to the boarding house together, reluctantly parting at her door with increasingly lingering goodnight kisses. It was both wonderful and torturous, this growing intimacy constrained by convention. Rose rose from her desk, gathering papers into a neat stack. "I've been thinking," she said casually, though something in her tone alerted Morgan that this wasn't an ordinary conversation, "about the future of the Chronicle." "Oh," Morgan set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "The town is growing. We'll need a proper office again soon, not just this temporary space." She kept her eyes on the papers she was organizing. "I've been looking at that vacant lot across from the general store. It's a good location for a new building." Morgan nodded. The lot she mentioned was indeed well situated, on the main street but set slightly apart from the saloons and noisier establishments. "Sounds sensible," he agreed. "When were you thinking of starting construction?" Rose finally looked up at him, her expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "In the spring. But before I commit to such a large investment, I need to be sure about certain other aspects of my future." Morgan's heart began to beat faster, sensing where this conversation was heading. "Such as?" he asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Rose set down her papers and moved around the desk to stand before him. "Such as whether I'll be building that office alone or with a partner, a full partner in every sense of the word." The directness of her approach was so typically Rose that Morgan nearly smiled despite his nervousness. She was never one to dance around important matters. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Miss Palmer?" he asked, rising to stand before her, close enough to catch the subtle lavender scent of her hair. "I'm proposing whatever arrangement would convince you to stay in Redemption Creek permanently, Mr. Pierce," she replied, her voice steady though a flush spread across her cheeks. With me. There it was, the question that had been hovering between them for weeks, finally given voice. Morgan had known it was coming, had even rehearsed his answer in his mind, yet now that the moment was here, he found himself struggling with doubts he thought he'd conquered. "Rose," he began carefully, "my past is your past," she interrupted gently. "Not your present, and certainly not your future unless you choose to make it so. The things I've done, the mistakes I've made, have shaped you, yes, but they don't define you." Rose took his hands in hers. "I know about Antelope Ridge, Morgan, not just what was in the newspapers, but what you've told me in the quiet moments when you wake from nightmares. I know you carry that burden. But I've also seen the man you truly are: brave, honorable, kind, despite everything you've endured." Morgan looked down at their joined hands, overcome by her faith in him, a faith he wasn't certain he deserved. "I'm not asking you to forget your past," Rose continued softly. "I'm asking you to build a future with me despite it, because of it even. The man you are today, the man I love, wouldn't exist without the path that brought you here." Her words hung in the air between them, the declaration of love both shocking and somehow inevitable. Morgan raised his eyes to hers, seeing nothing but sincerity and affection there. "I've been running for so long," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place, how to build something lasting." Rose's smile was gentle. "Then we'll learn together. I've never built a newspaper office from the ground up either. Or a marriage, for that matter." The word marriage sent a jolt through Morgan that was equal parts terror and longing. The thought of being truly bound to someone, of creating a life intertwined with another's, it was everything he had avoided since Antelope Ridge. And yet, with Rose, it felt not like a constraint but a liberation. "I can't promise I'll never have doubts," Morgan said honestly, "or that the ghosts won't sometimes come back." "I'm not asking for perfection," Rose replied, "just presence, just the willingness to try with me every day." Morgan took a deep breath, feeling as though he stood on the edge of a precipice. Behind him lay the solitary path he had walked for years, familiar in its isolation, safe in its detachment. Before him stretched an unknown future with this remarkable woman, uncertain but rich with possibility. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Yes," he said simply, "to all of it. The newspaper, the office, the marriage, everything, Rose, I want everything with you." The joy that illuminated her face was worth every moment of doubt, every mile he had traveled to reach this point. Morgan pulled her into his arms, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Rose pressed her forehead to his. "They said you'd never know peace," she whispered. "But they were wrong, weren't they?" Morgan thought about the first night she had fallen asleep on his chest, how the restlessness that had driven him for so long had quieted in that moment. How it continued to quiet a little more each day he spent by her side. "They were wrong," he agreed softly. "Because they never accounted for you." 3 months later, on a clear winter morning, Morgan Pierce stood on the steps of the newly rebuilt Redemption Creek Chronicle building, watching as his wife hung the freshly painted sign above the door. Rose had insisted on doing it herself, claiming it was a publisher's prerogative to christen her own establishment. "Perfect," she declared, climbing down from the ladder to stand beside him, admiring their handiwork. "What do you think?" Morgan gazed at the sign, which now read the Redemption Creek Chronicle R&M Pierce, publishers, in bold black letters. Below, in smaller text, was the paper's new motto, "Truth endures through fire." "It's perfect," he agreed, slipping an arm around her waist, "just like its publisher." Rose laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Pierce, though I believe that's co-publisher now." Inside, the new office gleamed with possibility. A larger, more modern printing press occupied the center of the main floor. Desks, one for each of them, sat by windows that flooded the space with natural light. Shelves lined the walls, already filling with books, reference materials, and bound volumes of past editions. Upstairs, their living quarters were spacious and comfortable, decorated with items they had chosen together, a marriage of Rose's refined taste and Morgan's practicality. A home built for two people who had found in each other something neither had expected to find: completion. The town had turned out in force for the Chronicle's grand reopening the previous day. Elijah Washington had presented them with a wrought iron gate for the front entrance, a beautiful piece he had crafted himself. Sila's tanner brought a rocking chair for their porch, for when you two start adding to the population of Redemption Creek, he'd said with a wink that had made Rose blush furiously. Mrs. Harper, now permanently returned to her farm, had baked enough pies and cakes to feed the entire gathering. And Thomas Riley, recently appointed as Rose's assistant editor, had presented them with a leather-bound journal for recording the paper's new beginning. Standing now on the steps of their completed building, Morgan marveled at how much had changed in just a few short months. Redemption Creek itself was transforming, growing from a dusty frontier town into a proper community with a school, a church, and businesses that served more than just the basic needs of survival. And he had changed too. The restlessness that had driven him for so long had finally settled. The ghosts still visited occasionally in dreams, in quiet moments, but they no longer commanded his every decision, no longer pushed him to constant motion to outrun their whispers. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "Peace," Morgan replied honestly. "And how it finds you when you stop running from its opposite," Rose smiled, understanding as she always did. "Very philosophical, Mr. Pierce. Perhaps you should write an editorial on the subject." "Perhaps I will, Mrs. Pierce," he countered, dropping a kiss on her forehead. After we finish the one about the new railroad proposal. They turned to enter their new office together, partners in every sense, ready to face whatever challenges the frontier might bring. And that night, as on every night since their wedding, Rose fell asleep on Morgan's chest, her steady breathing a lullaby that chased away the last of his ghosts. They said he'd never know peace. But in the end, Morgan Pierce found it in the most unexpected place in the arms of a newspaper woman who believed in truth, in justice, and most miraculously of all, in him. And in that peace, he finally found redemption.